Good evening. Thank you. Before we get started, I want to do a little audience participation. So do you all promise you will repeat whatever it is that I say? I'm a teacher, I need more than that. There we go. All right, repeat after me. Suicide. 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 Thank you. How'd that feel? If I were a betting man, and I'm not, but if I were, I would bet for most of you saying that out loud in public felt incredibly uncomfortable. It felt wrong, and if you were actually one of the ones that did it, you probably felt like you shouldn't have. Why is that? The short answer to that is social stigma. In the United States, where we like to compartmentalize just about everything, mental health is frequently put into a box. And then that box is hidden deep under a bed or far back in a closet and only thought about when forced upon us. From the extreme like schizophrenia to the more commonplace like anxiety and depression, our society thinks about mental health about as much as we think about a box of old sweaters in a closet or old Christmas decorations in an attic. In our individualistic culture, we don't want to imagine and much less admit that we have some personal flaw, and my air quotes were purposeful. This flaw would make us different, it would make us abnormal. In fact, in a 2013 study done by the National Institutes of Health, they claimed, and I want to get this right, public stigma is a pervasive barrier that prevents many individuals in the United States from engaging in mental health care. This stigma causes those with mental health issues to hide in a personal darkness inside a self-imposed box. The deepest of these personal darknesses, in the box that we like to think about least, is suicide. We don't talk about it. We don't want to talk about it. We avoid it at all costs. My goal tonight is to make the smallest of breaches in that barrier, to open that box just a bit so that when you all leave here, suicide doesn't carry quite the stigma that it used to. Hopefully once I finish, you'll have a different understanding, a different perspective on this pervasive topic. And I characterize it as pervasive because so many people that you encounter on a daily basis have had an experience of some kind of suicide, including me. When I was around 10 years old, I was first introduced to the idea of suicide when I witnessed someone attempt to end their own life. That someone was my mother. She took one of the razors from our bathroom and used it in an attempt to cut both of her wrists. She'd shut herself in there, and I remember beating on the door with my older sister in some desperate, childish attempt to help. Then I remember her opening the door, coming at us with her arms extended, and screaming, "Look!" Then she got in her car and drove off, leaving my two sisters and me alone. This talk is going to be heavy. Heavy but necessary. Necessary for so many reasons, least of which is my own personal catharsis. Looking back, I never realized just how troubled my mom was. She had just gotten out of an abusive 17-year marriage with my father. She was supporting herself and the 3 kids that she was trying to raise on her own, and she'd never really worked before. She was dealing with severe medical issues, she was abusing prescription medications, and she was enjoying her newfound freedom in ways that would have been much more appropriate for someone about half her age. She was also dealing with an undiagnosed mental illness, bipolar disorder. I'll never be able to recall for you what it was that sent her spiraling down that day, but I have relived her suicide attempt more times than I can remember. Sadly, it turns out this wasn't my last experience. The story I'm about to recount for you is one that I haven't told many people, in fact, only a handful, and even those people didn't get all the details. My students know that there's not much about myself that I'm unwilling to share. But this story has never been one that I've been very eager to divulge, except for a select few students that I've counseled over the years, and those students needed to hear it. And now you all do. When I was 13 years old, I reached the point where I was considering suicide. I remember laying in my bed in my darkened room in the house that I felt forced to move into when my mom remarried. My mom and stepdad would pass out in the living room on whatever cocktail of prescription medications they had that night. And apart from the setting, I only remember crying. And not the few tears and the sniffles, but the kind of crying that only accompanies moments when the soul is crying out to the universe in anguish. At 13, the number of tragedies that I'd lived through read like a made-for-TV movie. Low-quality housing, hunger, neglect, domestic abuse, drug-addicted parents. Add to that, I was the chubby, socially awkward, confused queer kid, and I had just come to the end of my rope. I had no resiliency left. I felt unloved, unwanted, and uncared for. And lying in bed that night, I knew that if I was gone, not a single person would miss me. I just wanted the pain and the confusion to end. Every message that I got about myself was negative, and I had started to buy into it. In my mind, there was nothing about myself that was worthy to carry on living. Now, I never made a plan of how to go about ending my life, and I never attempted to end it. I honestly have no memory of what changed about my feelings. I cannot tell you what it was that made me rethink the value of my own life. I wish there was some grand revelation I could say that showed how it cleansed my thoughts, and I really wish it was something that simple. But I want to shift the story forward now. At 22, I was in my first year teaching as part of Teach for America in Louisiana. I was teaching 7th and 8th grade in a parish about halfway between New Orleans and Baton Rouge. And one day, a student that I didn't have in my class wandered into my room and struck up a conversation. Now, it was evident from the beginning that he just needed someone to talk to, just as I had when I was his age. From then on, he'd come to me anytime he had something that he needed to talk to someone about, which was often. During spring break that year at about 2 a.m., I got a phone call. He was in tears, and what he was saying was barely comprehensible. But I recognized those tears. I described them as the kind of tears that accompany moments when the soul is crying out to the universe in anguish. With all the things he'd been dealing with, school, sports, family, friends, and his latest ex-girlfriend, he'd come to a point where he no longer wanted to live. I can only remember him clearly saying he just didn't want to hurt anymore. They don't prepare you for that conversation in new teacher orientation. Our phone call that night was very long, and he agreed not to do anything dangerous until he had went through all the different avenues of help that were available to him. And happily, I can say that last Friday, he graduated from high school. Another student walked into my classroom last fall and struck up a conversation. Now, sometimes it really feels like it's a repeat of what happened in Louisiana 6 years ago. Our conversation didn't start with him needing someone, but eventually it got to that. See, before I ever knew about the box, I had already decided that I would not hide my own anxiety and depression from my students. I wanted to start to break down the stigma and the barrier around mental health, even if it was for only the few I get to teach each semester. Now, for this student, it was like we were brothers in anxiety, which is an odd thing to say. He had been battling it since he was in kindergarten, and I had just recently laid claim to my own. We would share stories, feelings, coping mechanisms, and when he was down, I would try my best to lift him up. He'd take a few steps forward, then a few steps back, but it seemed like he was making progress. Then last month, I knew he was in a period of depression. Not much in his life was going what we would call positively, but I had no idea just how bad things were for him. One Monday morning, a friend of his stayed after class to tell me about how worried they were about him, and it caught me off guard. And by the end of the day, I was in a meeting with the assistant principal and our school psychologist to discuss doing a suicide risk assessment, not the first of my career. Once we completed it, he was determined to be high risk, and we had the steps in motion to get him the help that he needs. And it was honestly the hardest thing I have ever done as a teacher. And at the end of it, I was the one sitting in the principal's office in tears. And happily today, I can say he's better. And he's battling as hard as ever to continue on his positive track. Now, despite these stories, I can't help but think about the what ifs. What if that student hadn't called me at 2 a.m.? What if that student hadn't stayed after class to tell me about being worried about a friend? What if I had told myself that that other student's latest period of depression was normal and that I hadn't got that process going for that risk assessment? And the biggest question, what if there are more students sitting in my classroom right now who feel the exact same way? Now, all those anecdotes from one small town teacher don't express the true nature of suicide in this country. This data that I'm about to give you from the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention really should alarm you. In 2013, the number of deaths in this country from suicide was 41,149. That means that someone died by suicide in this country every 12.8 minutes, which is about how long most of these TED Talks could take. In total that year, suicide was the 10th leading cause of death in the United States. Homicide was just 16th. But tell me, when you turn on the news at your house, which do you hear more about? The question is, which do we as a society feel more comfortable talking about? When you look at the numbers demographically, it should cause even more alarm. The highest suicide rate in 2013 was for those ages 45 to 64, 19.1 deaths for every 100,000. The second highest was for those 85 years of age and older. Despite that, the data shows that our youth are attempting suicide at a much greater rate than any other age group. The suicide rate for men has pretty much always been 4 times the rate of women. And in 2013, the overwhelming majority of deaths by suicide were men. However, women attempt suicide 3 times as often as males. Now, beyond actual deaths, there's no data, or specific data, on injuries due to suicide attempts and other forms of self-harm. But it's estimated that for every suicide death in this country, there are 12 instances of self-injury. And none of these numbers even begin to encompass those who have suicidal thoughts and feelings but never actually make an attempt, and I fall into that category. I'm left with 3 questions. Where's the movement? Where's the outrage? And why aren't we trying to change this? I want to conclude with 2 messages for 2 different groups that are both responsible for erasing the stigma around suicide in the United States. First, I want to address all of us, myself included. Take the topic of suicide out of the box. Learn the warning signs. If you're concerned for someone, don't avoid the topic, don't tiptoe around it, address it, and call it by name, just like I had you do at the beginning. To the person that you are concerned for, show them that you love and care for him. Be there for her. Listen to him. Seek to help her in the best way that you can. Withhold any judgment. And if you know you cannot provide all the help that's needed, get more. My second message, for those who might be considering suicide. I want you to know that you are not alone. Chances are, someone that you know is feeling or has felt the exact same way that you are right now. I want you to know you're not abnormal, you're not weak, you're not broken, you're not lacking some fundamental aspect of a good character, and you are not exhibiting some bad behavior. I want you to know that you have sources of strength that you probably aren't even aware of. And I want you to know that there is help, more help than you could possibly imagine. Reach out to someone, a friend, a family member, a teacher, a mentor, and if you don't know where to turn, start with the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-TALK. It's confidential and it's free. I challenge you all when you leave here not to put this topic back in the box once I step off stage. We all have a role to play in changing those statistics. in helping those at risk and those in need, in reducing and ending the stigma around suicide in this country. And my sincerest hope is that you'll play your part. Thank you.